the silence here is not empty. It is heavy, oppressive, as if the very air is holding its breath. We have named this place Widow's Hollow, for it feels like a place where hope itself has died. From the last recovered letter of Archibald Wainwright, 1873. The world had bled out into shades of gray and blue. For the last hour, the sun had been nothing more than a pale, sickly smear on the horizon, a brief reprieve from the near-perpetual twilight of the Canadian North in deep winter. This wasn't the true, unending polar night, but it was close enough. Here, at the edge of the boreal forest, where the dense taiga began to thin into a stark, skeletal landscape, the days were short and the nights were an eternity. Our two snowmobiles, their engines a profane roar in the crushing silence, finally sputtered to a halt. Julian Carter, our leader, dismounted with the fluid economy of a man who had spent his life in hostile environments. He pulled off his goggles, his face a mask of wind-burned confidence, and consulted the GPS in his hand. Then a laminated, yellowed map. "This is it," he announced, his voice a low rumble that barely seemed to disturb the air. "According to Wainwright's coordinates and the topographical data, the last camp was right here, in the basin." I peered over the ridge. Below us lay a shallow, bowl-shaped valley, a few acres of flat, snow-covered ground ringed by black-fanged peaks and sparse, sentinel-like pines. It looked like a wound in the earth, a place the world had forgotten. An unnatural stillness clung to it. Even from up here, I could feel it. The sounds of our arrival, the engine ticks, the crunch of our boots, my own ragged breath, felt swallowed, muffled by a silence that was more a presence than an absence. "Why'd we leave the sleds here, Julian?" Marcus Dunn asked, his broad shoulders heaving as he unstrapped a heavy canvas duffel. He was our muscle, a former firefighter who radiated a simple physical certainty. "The last 50 miles follow Wainwright's original snowshoe and dog sled trail," Julian explained, his gaze sweeping the valley. It was a look I recognized from his briefing, the ex-Marine assessing a battlefield. "It's too dense, too rugged for the machines from here on out. Besides, it's part of the deal. The Odyssey Channel wants full immersion for the documentary. We go in on foot, we live like they did. That's what the Wainwright Centennial Grant is paying for." And so, the work began. It was a strange juxtaposition of centuries. We hauled gear down the slope, our modern Gore-Tex-clad figures setting up authentic 19th century canvas A-frame tents. Marcus, with his raw strength, cleared a fire pit area while Dr. Samuel Holloway, our expedition's brain, directed the placement of the camp with the meticulous precision of an archaeologist mapping a dig site. "The cook tent here," he'd say, pointing with a gloved finger, his eyes alight with academic fervor. Wainwright's journal mentions he placed it leeward of the main sleeping quarters to keep the sparks from the canvas. I, Caleb Finch, was the youngest, Holloway's graduate assistant, and the designated diarist. My job was to document everything, to be the all-seeing, unassuming eye of the project. I filmed the camp's construction, my breath pluming in the frigid air, the camera a cold alien weight in my hands. In a designated non-authentic corner, a small island of the 21st century existed. Leo Garrison, our tech specialist, was in his element there. A wiry man with a perpetual frown of concentration, he was already hooking up a portable gas generator, our concession to the non-existent sun for his solar panels, to a series of high-capacity lithium power stations. "The cold is already playing hell with the battery efficiency," he muttered to no one in particular, carefully tucking spare battery packs into an insulated pouch he kept inside his jacket. Everything under 0 Fahrenheit is a battle. He meticulously set up several motion-activated high-sensitivity cameras on tripods, positioning them to face the perimeter and the dark maw of the forest beyond. It was Marcus who made the first discovery, as he scraped away a thick layer of snow and frozen moss to create a flat base for the fire. His shovel struck something with a dull clink. He knelt, digging with his gloved fingers, and pulled a small, tarnished object from the frozen earth. He brushed it off and held it up. A silver locket, blackened with age, bearing the engraved initials A.W. Holloway gasped, snatching it from Marcus's hand with an uncharacteristic lack of decorum. "My God," he breathed, his eyes wide. He fumbled in his pack and produced a binder, flipping through laminated pages until he found what he was looking for, a copy of an old family portrait. "It's his, Archibald Wainwright's. It's mentioned in his wife's letters. We're here. We're really here." The energy in the camp surged. The cold, the fatigue, the oppressive quiet. It all vanished, replaced by the electric thrill of discovery. We had found our X on the map. That evening, gathered around the first crackling fire, Julian reiterated the rules. From this point on, we use the authentic gear. Period-accurate food, tools, clothing. The modern equipment is for emergencies only. Leo's generator stays on to power the documentation gear and the sat phone. We make 1 call a week to base camp to check in. The Iridium phone is not for casual conversation. It's a lifeline, and we use it only if that's what it's for. Am I clear? We all nodded. I filmed his speech, the firelight dancing on his serious face. This was it, the official start of the Phantom Act. But as the darkness deepened, swallowing the last of the twilight, the triumphant mood began to curdle. The silence returned thicker than before. The fire seemed to push it back only a few feet, and beyond that small circle of light, the woods were a solid wall of black. I felt a primal crawl of unease up my spine, the unshakable sensation of being watched from the dark forested slopes that cradled our tiny camp. Later, zipped into my period-accurate wool sleeping bag, the cold already seeping through the canvas, I struggled for sleep. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the soft snores from Marcus's tent. Then I heard it. A sharp, distinct crack from just outside my tent wall. It wasn't the sound of a twig snapping under a boot. It was wetter, heavier, like a thick bone being broken over a knee. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I strained to listen, but there was only the wind again. Just the frost, I told myself, my mind racing. Trees can make strange noises in the cold. I was too scared, too embarrassed to call out and sound like the rookie I was. The next morning I woke to the sound of Leo cursing. He was hunched over his laptop, his face pinched with irritation. "What's up?" Julian asked, sipping hot coffee from a tin mug. "The camera on the east perimeter," Leo said, pointing a frustrated finger at his screen. "The motion sensor was triggered 17 times last night. 17. But the memory card is nothing. Just a string of corrupted files. 0-byte garbage." "The cold?" I ventured. "It has to be," Leo snapped, though he didn't sound convinced. "Extreme cold can wreck electronics, but 17 times, and only on that one camera? It makes no sense." Julian just stared out towards the east, into the silent, waiting trees. He didn't say anything, but I saw a new tension in the set of his jaw. The Hollow was already playing its own games, and we had only just arrived. The third morning dawned in a shroud of freezing mist. The world was a watercolor painting of white on white, the trees smudged silhouettes against a pearl gray sky. I had the early watch, a miserable duty that involved pacing the camp's perimeter, my rifle a useless, heavy weight in my numb hands. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that gnawed at any exposed scrap of skin. I pulled my wool watch cap lower and shoved my hands deeper into my pockets, my mind drifting to thoughts of a warm bed and a hot breakfast. That's when I saw them. I stopped dead, my heart seizing in my chest. Near the fire pit, where only moments before there had been empty snow, stood 5 figures. They were translucent, shimmering at the edges like a heat haze on a summer road, their forms flickering in and out of focus. They were dressed in the heavy, rough-spun clothing of the 19th century, identical to the archival photos Holloway had shown us. One was crouched, appearing to mend something with phantom thread. Another stood with his back to me, his shoulders stooped in exhaustion. A third swung an axe that made no sound, striking a log that wasn't there. They were utterly silent. They moved with a slow, methodical purpose, engaged in mundane camp chores, completely oblivious to my presence. My breath caught in my throat, a knot of pure, unreasoning terror. I wanted to scream, to run, but my boots were frozen to the ground. With a surge of will, I tore my gaze away and stumbled back toward the tents, my mind screaming, "Julie and Dr. Holloway, wake up! Everybody get up!" They emerged one by one, groggy and annoyed, their complaints dying on their lips as they saw what I was seeing. The 5 shimmering figures continued their silent work, as insubstantial as smoke. Marcus swore under his breath, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the large knife on his belt. Leo just stared, his mouth agape, his skeptical worldview crumbling before his eyes. Julian's face was a granite mask of caution, his eyes scanning not the apparitions but the surrounding woods. It was Holloway who reacted with something other than fear. "Incredible," he whispered, his voice trembling with a kind of religious ecstasy. "Absolutely incredible." He scrambled back into his tent and emerged with his binder of notes. "That one," he pointed, "with the beard and the patched coat, that's Thomas Bell, the quartermaster. The descriptions from Wainwright's diary are perfect. And the man by the fire, that must be Elias Thorne." "Get the camera, Leo," Holloway commanded, his academic excitement overriding all else. Leo jolted into action, fumbled with his equipment. He raised his professional-grade camera, squinting through the viewfinder. "There's nothing there," he said, his voice thin and reedy. "I'm looking right at them. But on the screen, it's just the empty fire pit." He tried his phone, then a small handheld camcorder. The result was the same. The phenomenon was visible to the naked eye, but invisible to any lens. Holloway was undeterred. He was in his element, a historian presented with a living, breathing artifact. "What are they doing?" he murmured, consulting his diary copies. He flipped through the pages. "Wait. Here. November 10th, 1873. Thorne and Bell spent the morning mending the snowshoes, which were grievously damaged on the ascent. The work is slow and cold, and the men's spirits are low. They're reenacting a specific day. This was no random haunting. This was a playback, a piece of history trapped in a loop. The revelation settled over us, each man processing it differently. For Holloway, it was the discovery of a lifetime. For Leo, it was an infuriating paradox that defied every law of physics he held dear. He began muttering about geological anomalies, localized magnetic fields, some kind of light-refracting gas released from the permafrost. Marcus, ever the man of action, was simply frustrated. He scooped up a handful of snow, packed it into a ball, and hurled it at the figure of Thomas Bell. The snowball passed straight through the shimmering form and disintegrated against a tent pole on the other side. "What the hell are we supposed to do with this?" Marcus growled, his fists clenching. He was built to solve problems he could hit. This wasn't one of them. Julian remained the pragmatist. "We observe," he said, his voice steady. "We document what we see with our eyes, but we stay on alert. We don't know what this is, and we don't know if it's dangerous." The spectral scene faded with the rising sun, the figures dissolving like mist. The day passed in a state of tense anticipation. That evening, as dusk bled across the sky, they returned. This time, they were engaged in a different scene. Two of the phantoms, Bell, the quartermaster, and another man Holloway identified as a trapper named O'Connell, were arguing. Their ghostly faces were contorted in anger, their gestures sharp and aggressive. The argument was over a crate of supplies. We watched, mesmerized, as the spectral image of Bell shoved O'Connell, who stumbled back and then faded away. An hour later, the real-world echo occurred. Julian and Marcus went to our own supply corner to get rations for dinner. "The hell?" Marcus's voice cut through the quiet. We all rushed over. Our primary crate of modern high-energy food bars and canned stew, our emergency reserve, had been tampered with. The heavy-duty plastic clasps were broken, and the lid was ajar. Several cans of stew were gone. There were no tracks in the snow around the crate except our own from earlier in the day. Leo's face was pale. "That's not possible. That's a violation of everything. An apparition can't physically interact with a sealed container." "Apparently it can," Julian said grimly. He ordered an immediate tightening of security. 2-man watches, full perimeter sweeps every 30 minutes. Nobody goes anywhere alone. It was during his sweep later that night that Marcus found it. Near the edge of the woods, pressed clearly into a fresh patch of snow, was a single footprint. It was long and narrow, impossibly so. It looked vaguely human, but the proportions were all wrong. The heel was too small, the arch too deep, and the toes were elongated, almost like talons. It was a deeply unsettling, unnatural shape. "Julian, Caleb, get over here," Marcus hissed. We ran to his position, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. I saw the track and felt a cold dread wash over me that had nothing to do with the temperature. As Holloway and Leo joined us, a sudden wind kicked up, and fine powdery snow began to swirl around us. Within a minute, the strange, solitary print was gone, erased by the nascent blizzard, as if it had never been there at all. We were left staring at a smooth, blank canvas of white. The image of that monstrous foot burned into our minds. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the world encased in a fresh, pristine layer of snow under a sky full of cold, indifferent stars. The temperature plummeted. It was Marcus and I on the midnight watch. The silence so profound it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. We stood on opposite ends of the camp, the fragile glow of the banked fire a tiny island of warmth between us. It was then that the phantoms returned. The scene they played out tonight was different. It wasn't a mundane chore or a petty squabble. A lone spectral figure, the sentry from Wainwright's crew, stood on the very edge of the camp, peering into the darkness, the exact spot where I was standing now. He was a faint, shimmering outline of a man holding a rifle that wasn't there. We'd seen him before, a static part of the nightly tableau. But tonight, he moved. The phantom sentry suddenly stiffened, his head snapping up as if he'd heard something in the woods. He raised his non-existent rifle. From the deep black between the trees, another shadow detached itself from the darkness. It wasn't like the phantoms. This one was solid, darker than the night around it. It was impossibly tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its movements a horrifying combination of animal grace and jerky, unnatural angles. It moved with a speed that defied physics, a silent blur of motion. Before the phantom sentry could react, the shadow thing was upon him. It reached out with a long, spindly arm and simply took him. The ghostly figure of the sentry was enveloped by the darkness, and for a terrifying instant, his shimmering form seemed to cry out, his mouth open in a silent, agonized scream, before he dissolved into nothing. The tall shadow retreated back into the woods as silently as it had appeared. A tremor of pure horror shot through me. I stood frozen on the exact spot where the phantom had just been extinguished. And then I heard it. Not a phantom sound, but a real one directly behind me. A dry, chilling whisper that sounded like ice scraping against stone. Caleb. It spoke my name. I spun around, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest, and saw them. 2 points of dim, phosphorescent light like dull coals, hovering in the darkness about 8 feet off the ground. They were eyes. His eyes. I didn't think. I reacted. My hand, clumsy with cold and terror, fumbled for the flare gun on my belt. I ripped it free, pointed it at the eyes, and pulled the trigger. With a loud whoosh, a brilliant red flare shot into the night, momentarily illuminating the tree line in a hellish demonic glow. The eyes vanished instantly. The flare's dying arc plunged us back into darkness, but the camp was already in chaos. What was that? What happened? Julian yelled, scrambling from his tent with a rifle in his hand. It was here, I stammered, my voice cracking. The thing from the vision, it was right behind me. The horrifying truth crashed down on us all at once. This wasn't a movie we were watching. We were in it. The script wasn't just replaying, it was demanding new actors. We were slated to be the cast of a snuff film written a century and a half ago. Panic set in. Leo, his face a mask of disbelief and terror, scrambled for the Iridium satellite phone. "I'm calling it in," he said, his fingers fumbling with the case. "Screw the documentary, screw the grant. We're getting out of here." He activated the phone, holding the receiver to his ear. We watched, holding our breath. His expression shifted from frantic hope to confusion, then to stark fear. "It's just static," he whispered, his eyes wide. He held the phone out so we could hear the harsh crackle. And then, woven into the static, faint but unmistakable, we all heard it. The same icy, sibilant whisper that had called my name. It slithered out of the speaker before the phone died with a fizzle of fried electronics, the smell of burnt plastic filling the air. Holloway, who had been pale and trembling, seemed to find a new, desperate resolve. Fear was being replaced by the frantic need for an answer. "The folklore," he muttered, rushing to his tent and retrieving a thick, leather-bound book. It was filled with his research on the oral traditions of the local Cree and Algonquin tribes. He spread it open on a supply crate, his fingers tracing the lines of text under the beam of his headlamp. "Here," he said, his voice low and grim. "It's a story the elders tell, a warning. They speak of a spirit of the lonely places, born of hunger and cannibalism. A spirit of insatiable appetite. They call it the Wendigo." He looked up at us, his face ashen. "It's not just a monster. It's a curse tied to this land. The legend says it can mimic human voices to lure its victims. It doesn't just hunt you, it infects your mind. It's the personification of starvation itself. We were no longer just historians or adventurers. We were prey." The next day's spectral vision was of a man, O'Connell, walking toward the frozen creek a few hundred yards from camp, supposedly to fetch water. In the original diary, he never returned. "We break the cycle," Julian declared, his voice hard. "We have the script. We know what's supposed to happen, so we do the opposite. Nobody goes near that creek. We melt snow for water. We stay in camp and we stay together." For a few hours, it felt like a victory. We had outsmarted the Hollow. We had defied the script. A fragile sense of control returned to the camp. But the Hollow and its master would not be so easily denied. That night, a tremendous crack echoed from the direction of the creek, a sound like a cannon shot that jolted us all from our fitful sleep. It was followed by a grinding, splintering noise. The next morning, armed and bunched together like frightened sheep, we cautiously approached the creek. The ice, which had been a solid foot thick, strong enough to hold the weight of a truck, was shattered. A huge gaping hole had been smashed in the center, the edges jagged and sharp. It looked as if something of immense weight had been dropped on it from a great height. And leading away from the hole back towards our camp was a trail of wet footprints on the snow. They stopped abruptly at our woodpile, which was now inexplicably damp. The creature hadn't needed us to come to it. If we wouldn't follow the script, it would simply bring the scene to us. The psychological assault began in earnest. Marcus, standing watch, heard the faint cries of his former firefighting partner, a man who had died in a building collapse 2 years ago, calling for help from the woods. Leo, staring at the blank, dead screen of his laptop, saw the distorted, weeping face of his wife flash for a split second. The Wendigo wasn't just outside the camp anymore. It was inside our heads, feasting on our fears, turning our sanctuary into a madhouse of paranoia and grief. The entity in the woods was a master of psychological warfare. Its next move was not one of direct violence, but of insidious sabotage, an attack aimed directly at our morale and our most basic human need. We awoke on the 6th day to a scene of calculated desecration. Our primary food cache, the authentic 19th century supplies, the salted beef, hardtack biscuits, and dried beans that were supposed to sustain us, had been ravaged. But the food wasn't gone. It was destroyed. Sacks of flour and beans had been torn open and their contents scattered across the snow. The salted meat was strewn about, covered in a foul, glistening slime that steamed faintly in the frigid air. It was an act of pure malice, not of an animal seeking sustenance. It was a message: you will starve. Holloway, his face a grim mask, stared at the ruin. "It's driving us toward the same end," he murmured, "depriving us of sustenance to weaken our bodies and our minds." As if on cue, the spectral theater began its daily performance. This time, the phantoms were gathered around their fire pit, their movements slow and lethargic. The ghostly figure of Wainwright was dividing a pitifully small portion of food among his men. We watched as one of the apparitions, a young man Holloway's notes identified as the expedition's cook, stumbled and fell to the snow, too weak to stand. The other phantoms barely seemed to notice, too lost in their own misery. Holloway fumbled for his binder, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the pages. His face had taken on a waxy, unhealthy pallor. "It's here," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Wainwright writes, the hunger is no longer a simple emptiness in the belly. It is a worm that gnaws at the mind, a constant droning thought that eclipses all others. Young Miller collapsed today. He has refused what little food we have. The weakness has taken him." The parallel was immediate and terrifying. As the day wore on, I began to feel unwell. A deep chill settled into my bones that no amount of clothing could warm, and a wave of profound weakness washed over me. By midday, I was shivering uncontrollably, a fever starting to burn behind my eyes. When Julian brought me a cup of hot broth, the smell of it turned my stomach. "I'm not hungry," I mumbled, pushing it away, the words feeling alien in my own mouth. I looked up and saw the horror in Julian's eyes. My behavior was mirroring that of the starving phantom Miller with chilling accuracy. I was becoming part of the performance. "That's it. To hell with the experiment," Julian declared, his voice a low growl of fury. "We're breaking into the emergency supplies. The real food." This was our final firewall, a sealed military-grade Pelican case containing modern, high-calorie meals ready to eat and canned goods. It was our guarantee against the very situation we now faced. Marcus, with renewed purpose, used a crowbar to pry open the hermetically sealed case. We all leaned in, a desperate hope surging through us. The hope died in an instant. A faint putrid smell wafted from the opened case. Every single can of stew and chili was swollen, the lids bulging ominously. The vacuum-sealed MRE pouches were puffed up like balloons, and when Marcus tore one open, we saw that the contents were covered in a thick black mold that looked disturbingly alive. "No," Leo whispered, his voice cracking. "That's impossible. They're designed to be stable for years. In this temperature, they should be frozen solid. They can't spoil. They can't." But they had. It was a violation of the laws of chemistry and biology. The creeping dread we'd felt was replaced by a stark, gut-wrenching despair. The hollow was not bound by the rules of our world. It could curdle hope as easily as it could spoil food. The sight of it broke something in Marcus. His fear, which had been a quiet, simmering thing, flash-boiled into rage. "I'm not going to sit here and starve," he snarled, grabbing the heavy-caliber rifle we'd rented from an outfitter in the last town. The outfitter had handled the Canadian permits, a simple matter for a guided expedition. Now, the weapon felt like our only sane option. "I'm going to hunt this thing down and kill it." "Marcus, no," Julian commanded. "You don't go out there alone. That's what it wants." But Marcus was beyond reason. He shrugged off Julian's restraining hand. "I've seen its tracks. It's flesh and blood, and anything that's flesh and blood can be killed." He stalked out of the camp, his powerful strides carrying him into the tree line, following a set of the now ubiquitous long-toed tracks that seemed to appear and disappear at will. We could only watch him go, a profound sense of doom settling over the camp. Hours passed. The weak sun rose and set without Marcus's return. The psychological pressure mounted. I could hear the thing whispering in the edges of my hearing, promising warmth, promising food if I would just walk into the trees. It was well after dark when Marcus stumbled back into the firelight. He was a changed man. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide and haunted. His jacket was torn, and he was covered in snow, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. "Did you see it?" Julian asked, helping him to a log near the fire. Marcus shook his head, staring into the flames. "No, but it was there." His voice was hollow. "The tracks, they just led me in circles, for miles, always back towards camp. I never got more than a mile out. I could hear it, a branch snapping behind me. I'd turn and there'd be nothing. Then I'd hear it in front of me, to the side." He looked up at us, his tough guy bravado completely shattered. It was playing with me. The whole time. It was everywhere at once. He dropped his head into his hands. The strongest among us, the man who believed any problem could be solved with force, had just met an enemy he couldn't fight. His confidence, like our food, had been irrevocably spoiled. The night after Marcus's failed hunt, the Hollow delivered its most devastating blow yet, an attack aimed not at our bodies, but at our minds, at the very record of our predicament. The phantoms appeared as usual, their silent, looping tragedy playing out in the center of camp. This time, the vision was of Archibald Wainwright himself. His ghostly form stood over the dying embers of his fire, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. In his hands, he held his journal. With a final desperate gesture, he tossed the book into the flames, watching as the spectral pages curled and vanished. He was erasing his own story. The vision faded, leaving a profound sense of loss in its wake. An hour later, Holloway let out a cry of pure anguish from his tent. We rushed in to find him on his hands and knees, frantically throwing aside his sleeping bag and personal effects. "It's gone," he stammered, his face a mask of disbelief. "My binder. The one with all the diary copies, the maps, my research, it's gone." We tore the tent apart. We searched the entire camp. Nothing. The binder, our single most important tool, our script and our guide, had vanished without a trace from the inside of a zipped-up tent. The loss was catastrophic. We were now blind. We had no way of knowing what scene the phantoms would enact next, no way to anticipate the corresponding horror that would befall us. Holloway, robbed of his academic armor, crumbled. He sat by the fire, rocking back and forth, trying to recall the sequence of events from Wainwright's journal, but his memory, fractured by fear and exhaustion, failed him. The details were a jumble, the timeline a blur. The sickness. Then the second man vanished. Or was it the argument first? I can't remember. The camp's fragile unity shattered. The creeping paranoia that had been whispering at the edges of our minds now screamed. Leo, his skepticism long since curdled into a twitchy, feral terror, rounded on Marcus. "You did it?" he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "You were on watch. You got spooked by a shadow and you panicked. You probably thought it was the monster and threw it into the woods." "What are you talking about?" Marcus roared, getting to his feet. His own frayed nerves were exposed and raw. "You're the one who's been losing it, seeing your wife on a dead laptop. Maybe you're the one who took it." "Enough." Julian's voice cut through the rising hysteria like a whip crack. He physically stepped between them, a bulwark of strained authority. Fighting each other is exactly what it wants. It's turning us against ourselves. We pull it together right now, but the damage was done. The trust was gone, replaced by a poison of suspicion. Julian's control was slipping, and we all knew it. The Wendigo sensed our division and changed its tactics. The whispers were no longer just echoes of our past traumas. They became intimate, insidious thoughts, planted directly into our minds. "He's leading you to your deaths, Leo." A voice that sounded like his own reason whispered in his head. "Julian's pride is going to get you all killed." He failed. "Caleb is sick, Marcus," it hissed in the former firefighter's thoughts. "He's not himself anymore. Look at his eyes. The hunger is changing him. He's not human." And to Julian, a constant crushing litany of failure. You lost the food. You lost the binder. You lost Marcus's nerve. You let them down. You let them all down. I felt it too. A cold suggestion that Holloway was hoarding food. That Marcus viewed me as a liability to be cut loose. The entity was systematically dismantling our group from the inside out, using our own fears as its tools. Sometime before dawn, Julian made a decision. His face was set in grim, hard lines. "This is over," he announced. "The experiment is a failure. The project is dead. We're getting out. We're abandoning the camp, taking only what we can carry, and we're making a break for the snowmobiles at first light." It was an admission of defeat, but it was also a spark of hope. The 50-mile trek would be brutal, but it was a tangible goal, a path out of this cursed hollow. For the first time in days, a sense of shared purpose returned as we began to prepare, sorting the bare essentials we would need for the journey. But the hollow had one final act for us to witness. As the first hint of gray light touched the eastern peaks, the phantoms appeared for their last, most horrific performance. They were no longer just tired or sad. They were feral. Their spectral forms were twisted, their movements jerky and desperate. We watched in stunned silence as the apparitions, maddened by a ghostly hunger, turned on each other. It was a silent, terrible ballet of violence, phantoms tearing at phantoms in a frenzy of cannibalistic rage. And standing in the center of the camp, watching the chaos unfold, was the tall, gaunt shadow of the Wendigo. It wasn't participating. It was observing, its form radiating a palpable aura of satisfaction. It was a director admiring its final scene. The vision faded as the sun crested the mountains, leaving us shaken to our core. We had just witnessed the final grisly end of the Wainwright expedition. "Let's go," Julian ordered, his voice tight. "Everyone, grab your packs. It's time to leave this place to its ghosts." We turned to my tent where I had been resting, still weak with fever. "Caleb," Julian called. "Time to move." There was no answer. Julian unzipped the tent flap and peered inside. He stood frozen for a second, then slowly backed away, his face ashen. My tent was empty. My pack, my boots, my heavy coat. They were all still there, neatly placed next to my sleeping bag. But I was gone. And leading away from the tent, pressing deep into the fresh snow, was a single set of tracks. They were the tracks of a man walking barefoot into the frozen wilderness. They were my tracks. The sight of my bare footprints leading out of the camp and into the maw of the forest galvanized what was left of our fractured group. The internal squabbles, the paranoia, it all evaporated, replaced by the single urgent imperative to find me. "It has him," Holloway croaked, his face a mess of despair and dawning comprehension. "It's the final stage. It's luring him away." "Leo, you stay here with the doctor," Julian commanded, his voice once again the cold, clear instrument of a man in charge. The crisis had given him back his purpose. "Keep the fire high. If you see anything, you fire 3 shots into the air. Marcus, you're with me." Marcus, who had been staring at my tracks with a look of horrified guilt, nodded grimly. The whispers that had poisoned his mind against me were gone, replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. He and Julian, armed with rifles and a grim determination, plunged into the woods, following the path I had inexplicably forged. The trail was bizarre and deeply unsettling. I had walked in a straight line, seemingly oblivious to the knee-deep snow and the brutal cold. My stride was even, purposeful, not the stumbling gait of someone delirious. It was as if I were being pulled forward by an invisible string. After nearly a mile, they found my wool socks lying discarded on the snow as if I'd casually taken them off. Another half-mile, and they found my shirt, neatly folded on a low-hanging pine bough. "Paradoxical undressing," Julian muttered, his breath pluming. "Terminal stage of hypothermia. The victim feels like they're burning up and strips off their clothes." "You think that's all this is?" Marcus asked, his voice low. "Just a kid freezing to death?" Julian didn't answer. He just pointed ahead. The tracks continued, unwavering. This wasn't the random wandering of a dying man. This was a pilgrimage. They both knew the hypothermia was just a symptom. The disease was this place, this entity. It wasn't just that I felt hot. The creature was stealing my warmth, and I was shedding my layers like a snake sheds its skin, offering up my life piece by piece. The tracks led them to the base of a dark granite cliff face, a wall of rock that loomed over them like a tombstone. At its base was a narrow fissure, a dark crack leading into the heart of the mountain. And from the blackness of that cave opening, a sound echoed faintly. It was the sound of someone weeping. It was my voice. "Caleb!" Marcus yelled, his relief and fear warring in his voice. Without a second thought, he broke into a run, charging towards the cave mouth. "Marcus, wait! It's a trap!" Julian shouted, a cold dread seizing him. He knew this pattern. The creature used mimicry, baiting its prey with the voices of their loved ones. But it was too late. Marcus plunged into the darkness of the fissure. Julian, right behind him, flicked on the powerful flashlight mounted to his rifle, its beam cutting a stark white cone into the gloom. The weeping stopped. The thing that unfolded itself from the shadows was not me. In the harsh glare of the flashlight, they saw it in its full, horrific glory. It was impossibly tall, over 8 feet, but so emaciated that its gray, corpse-like skin was stretched taut over its bones. Patches of coarse, black hair clung to its desiccated flesh. Its limbs were unnaturally long and jointed at odd angles, ending in dirty, talon-like fingers. But the head was the worst. It was a bleached, elongated skull, like that of a deer or an elk, but with a jagged, lipless mouth hanging open. And in the deep, dark sockets, 2 embers of malevolent, ancient light burned with a hungry fire. The Wendigo. It uncoiled with terrifying speed and lunged, not at Julian, but at Marcus, the closest and most immediate threat. Marcus, to his credit, didn't flinch. He brought his rifle up, but the creature was too fast. It swatted the weapon from his grasp with a sickening crunch of wood and steel. The two collided in a flurry of motion. Marcus, driven by pure adrenaline, roared and threw his entire weight into the creature. He was a bull of a man, all muscle and raw power, but it was like tackling a statue made of iron and ice. He wrapped his arms around its skeletal torso, and the thing let out a sound, a high-pitched shriek that was part static, part grinding rock. "Julian, run!" Marcus screamed, his voice strained with the monumental effort of holding on. He was grappling with a nightmare, his face inches from that lipless mouth. "Get back to the others! Save them! Go!" Julian stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mind screaming at him to help, to fight. But he was a strategist. He saw the reality of the situation in a brutal, instantaneous calculation. The narrow cave, the creature's impossible speed and strength. A fight meant 2 deaths instead of 1. Marcus was buying him time. It was a sacrifice. With a sob of rage and despair, Julian backed away, keeping the light trained on the horrific struggle. He saw the Wendigo's long, taloned fingers dig into Marcus's back. He heard Marcus let out a final, choked cry of agony. Then Julian turned and ran, the sounds of the struggle, the tearing of flesh, the snapping of bone, pursuing him out of the darkness. He didn't stop running until the sounds had faded and the tree line of the camp was in sight. He stumbled into the firelight, wounded, broken, and alone. "Marcus?" Leo asked, his voice a tiny, hopeful squeak. Julian just shook his head, unable to speak, the guilt and horror of physical weight in his chest. He had left a man to die. He had followed an order. Hope, What little remained was extinguished. They were now just 3 survivors, waiting for the end. That night, as the 3 of them sat huddled by the fire, a sudden crackle of static erupted from the small 2-way radio Leo had brought, a piece of gear he had declared broken days ago. The static cleared for a single, impossible moment, and a voice filled the silence. It was my voice, but it was calm, clear, and devoid of fear. "It's hungry. It will always be hungry. Don't repeat their mistake." The radio sparked, a puff of acrid smoke rising from its speaker. Then, silence returned, deeper and more profound than ever. Marcus was gone. I was gone. The camp, once a hub of ambitious energy, had become a morgue waiting for its final occupants. 3 men remained, each a portrait of a different kind of ruin. Julian, the stoic leader, was now a hollowed-out shell of a man, haunted by the echoing scream of his sacrificed friend. His authority had crumbled with his spirit. Leo, the man of logic and technology, had been stripped of both. He was now a bundle of raw, twitching nerves, starting at every shadow, his eyes darting back and forth as if watching invisible things scurry at the edge of the firelight. And then there was Dr. Holloway. The esteemed professor had retreated deep inside himself, into a state of near catatonic shock. He sat on a log, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames with unseeing eyes, occasionally muttering fragments of Wainwright's journal, his historical record now a litany of doom. Our authentic 19th century gear was a cruel joke. The canvas tents were torn, the tools useless. We were 3 modern men, stripped of our technology, our confidence, and our hope, stranded in a 19th century nightmare. Then something shifted. Holloway suddenly blinked, his eyes focusing for the first time in hours. He looked at Julian, a flicker of his old, sharp intellect returning to his gaze. "Don't repeat their mistake," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. He was quoting the last message from my ghostly radio transmission. "What are you talking about, Sam?" Julian asked, his tone weary. "Their mistake," Holloway repeated, his voice gaining strength. "Wainwright's mistake. I've been thinking about it all wrong. All this time I thought their fatal error was the cannibalism, that it was the act that damned them, that birthed the curse." He shook his head slowly. But that was the end of the story. The mistake came before that. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a desperate, feverish intensity. Their mistake was staying. They stayed and they fought. They stayed and they starved. They stayed and they despaired. They tried to win a battle that couldn't be won. They were feeding the creature, Julian. Not with their flesh, not at first. They were feeding it with their fear, their paranoia, their dwindling hope. That's what it truly hungers for. We're doing the exact same thing. A wild, audacious plan began to form on his face. We can't run. It's too fast, too strong. It will pick us off one by one on the trail, just like it was about to do with Caleb. Running is part of the script. "So, what do we do, Sam?" Julian asked, a sliver of hope rekindling in his eyes. "What's the plan?" "We don't run," Holloway said, a strange, grim smile touching his lips. "We end the play. We give the monster the finale it expects. We have to stage our own deaths. We destroy this camp, make it look like we were all taken, that the cycle is complete. We erase ourselves. Then we hide. We wait until it believes the show is over, and it loses interest. We starve it of its true food, our terror." The plan was insane. A desperate, last-ditch gamble based on a historian's interpretation of a ghost's whisper. But it was better than sitting here waiting to be picked off. Julian nodded slowly. "Okay, it's a crazy plan. but it's the only one we've got." But Leo wasn't listening. His mind had already snapped. The weeks of relentless psychological pressure had finally broken him. He saw the intense look on Holloway's face, the desperate hope on Julian's, and interpreted it through the lens of his own terror. "No," Leo hissed, scrambling to his feet and backing away from the fire. "I see what this is. A new plan. You need a sacrifice, don't you? To distract it while you two get away. That's what you did with Marcus. Now it's my turn." "Leo, that's not it," Julian said, holding his hands up in a calming gesture. "Listen to him. It makes sense." "I'm not listening to any more of your crazy talk," Leo shrieked. His eyes were wild. "You're not sacrificing me." Before Julian could react, Leo grabbed a heavy, frozen log from the woodpile and swung it. The blow caught Julian on the side of the head. He staggered back, a grunt of pain escaping his lips as he crumpled to the snow. Leo didn't hesitate. He scrambled toward the pathetic pile of remaining gear, grabbing a pack, the last working flashlight, and the knife from Julian's belt. With a final, terrified glance back at the two of them, he bolted, running blindly into the oppressive darkness of the woods. Holloway rushed to Julian's side. A nasty gash was bleeding freely onto the snow, but he was conscious. "Leo, you fool." Julian groaned, trying to sit up. They didn't have to wait long. Perhaps 30 minutes later, a sound cut through the night from the direction Leo had fled. It wasn't a long, drawn-out struggle. It was a single, short, piercing shriek of absolute terror. Then, the profound, predatory silence of the hollow returned. Julian struggled to his feet, clutching his head. He and Holloway looked at each other over the crackling fire. The group was down to two, the historian and the soldier. They were all that was left, and their only hope was to convince the ancient evil that stalked this valley that they, too, were already dead. "Let's get to work," Julian said, his voice grim. "The performance of our lives." They began the methodical destruction of their own last refuge, their movements illuminated by the lonely fire. Two desperate actors preparing the set for their final, vanishing act. There was no time for grief or hesitation. As Leo's final scream faded into the all-consuming silence, a cold, clear purpose settled over Julian and Holloway. The Wendigo would be coming back to the camp. It had tasted blood, and its attention would now be fully focused on the last two survivors. Their insane plan had to be executed, and it had to be perfect. They worked with a frantic, desperate energy, fueled by adrenaline and the terror of the ticking clock. This was Julian's world now. Not a historical reenactment, but a Black Ops mission of deception. "We need to make this look like a slaughter," he grunted, his voice tight with pain from the gash on his head. He pressed a rag to the wound, then smeared the blood-soaked cloth across the snow near the fire pit. He dragged his foot through it, creating the impression of a body being violently pulled away. "Holloway, your coat. Tear a piece off." Holloway, his academic fragility burned away by the raw instinct to survive, ripped a large swatch from the sleeve of his parka and tossed it near the bloodstain. They worked methodically, a two-man crew staging the aftermath of a massacre. They slashed the remaining tent canvas with Julian's knife, scattering the contents, sleeping bags, spare clothes, Holloway's now useless books, across the camp. They overturned the supply crates, kicked snow over the fire to make it look like it had been extinguished in a struggle, and used the last of their fuel to char the edges of the torn canvas. Every action was designed to tell a story of chaos, violence, and a swift, brutal end. Their final act of deception was the most crucial. Their hiding place. During the first day's survey of the valley, Julian's tactical eye had noted a small, almost invisible feature. A deep rock crevice on the far side of the camp, its entrance obscured by a cluster of stunted, wind-blasted pines and a heavy snowdrift. It was barely a cave, more of a vertical fissure in the cliff face, just wide enough for two men to squeeze into. They gathered the last of their gear, a single water bottle and the knife, and made their way to the crevice. As the first hint of pre-dawn light began to ghost the mountain peaks, they slipped inside. The space was claustrophobically tight. They wedged themselves into the frozen rock. Then Julian reached out and carefully pulled snow and dead branches over the entrance, sealing them in. He left a tiny, almost microscopic hole to see through and for air. Then they fell silent, entombed in the cold, dark belly of the mountain. The wait was the purest form of torture. Every minute stretched into an hour. The cold was immediate and absolute, seeping through their layers of clothing and sinking into their bones. They dared not move, hardly dared to breathe. They could only sit in the suffocating darkness, listening. It did not keep them waiting long. They didn't hear it approach. There were no snapping twigs, no crunching footsteps. One moment the world outside was silent. The next, a presence was there. Julian, peering through his tiny peephole, saw it step into the ruined clearing. The Wendigo. In the flat, gray light of dawn, it was even more horrifying than it had been in the cave. Its movements were slow, deliberate. It glided through the wreckage of their camp like a landlord surveying a trashed property. It bent its long, spindly form down, its deer skull head tilting as it examined the bloodstain in the snow. It picked up the scrap of Holloway's coat with its talon-like fingers, holding it for a moment before letting it flutter back to the ground. It emitted a low sound, a soft, guttural click, like stones being knocked together. It was a sound of appraisal, of satisfaction. Then it began to circle the clearing, its movements becoming more agitated. It was searching, sniffing the air. It was looking for them. The pressure inside the crevice became unbearable. Julian could feel a wave of psychic dread wash over them, an aura of pure malevolence emanating from the creature. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature, a profound despair that threatened to shatter his will. The creature stopped directly in front of their hiding place. Through the peephole, Julian could see its burning coal eyes scanning the rock face, only feet away. It knew. It had to know. The whisper started in their minds again, no longer a mimicry of lost loved ones, but a seductive, intimate promise. So cold in there, so dark. It's warm out here. There is food. Just come out. The pain will stop. Beside him, Julian heard Holloway begin to whimper, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. The professor was breaking. He started to mutter, to push against Julian's side as if to get out. Julian reacted instantly, clamping a hand over Holloway's mouth, pressing him back against the rock. He held him there, his own body trembling with the strain, as he stared into the eyes of the monster through the tiny hole. He willed it to leave, pouring every ounce of his discipline, his marine training, his sheer bloody-minded stubbornness into that silent plea. We are not here. We are dead. The show is over. The Wendigo stood there for what felt like an eternity, its head cocked, listening to the silence. The psychic pressure was immense, a physical weight trying to crush them. Then slowly, the pressure eased. The creature let out a low, sighing sound, a noise of finality. It turned its back on their hiding spot and with the same unnatural gliding motion, moved across the clearing and disappeared into the trees. It was gone. But they didn't move. Julian held his hand over Holloway's mouth until the professor's shivering subsided. They remained in their rocky tomb throughout the entire day and into the next night, fighting off sleep, frostbite, and the ghosts of their own minds. They listened to the wind howling outside, imagining the creature's return with every gust. Finally, when the second dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Julian dared to push away the snow from their entrance. He peered out. The valley was empty. The snow was untouched. The silence was different now. It was no longer oppressive and watchful. It was just empty. Dead. Their performance had been a success. The audience had gone home. Emerging from the crevice was like being born into a dead world. They were stiff, half-frozen, and blinking against the painful glare of the sun on the snow. The ruins of their camp were a grim testament to their staged demise. They had nothing. No food, no shelter, no weapons save for Julian's knife. All that lay between them and survival was 50 miles of brutal, unforgiving wilderness. "We move west," Julian said, his voice a hoarse croak. "Follow the sun in the afternoon. Keep the wind at our backs, 1 foot in front of the other. That's all there is." The journey was a slow-motion descent into hell. The initial wave of relief at having survived the Wendigo was quickly replaced by the gnawing, immediate reality of their situation. The hunger was a physical pain, a dull, constant ache in their bellies that soon sharpened into a ravenous agony. The cold was their constant companion, a relentless enemy that sought out every gap in their clothing. Julian, running on the fumes of his training, took the lead. He showed Holloway how to stuff his boots with dry pine needles for extra insulation, how to walk in a way that conserved the most energy, how to read the subtle signs of the terrain to avoid deep snowdrifts. He was a machine built for this, but even the machine was breaking down. Holloway the academic was a different story. His body, unused to such hardship, began to fail almost immediately. He stumbled often, his breathing labored. But where his physical strength failed, a surprising, flinty resilience took over. The man who had crumbled in the face of the supernatural now faced the primal challenge of survival with a quiet, grim-faced determination. He held on to Julian's words as if they were a lifeline, his mind clinging to the simple, logical steps needed to stay alive. They were haunted, but not by the Wendigo. They were haunted by the ghosts of their friends. Every snap of a twig was Marcus falling in the cave. Every gust of wind was Leo's final scream. They walked in a bubble of shared trauma, rarely speaking, each lost in his own private replay of the horrors they had endured. They constantly looked over their shoulders, a deep-seated dread telling them that the tall, skeletal figure was pacing them, just out of sight. On the third day, when they were both on the verge of collapse, their minds beginning to fog with exhaustion and starvation, they found a miracle. Tucked away in a small copse of thicker pines was an old, dilapidated hunter's cabin. It was barely more than a shed, but its door was unlocked. Inside, coated in dust and rodent droppings, was a treasure beyond measure. 2 cans of beans, a half-empty tin of crackers, and a small pile of dry firewood next to a rusted potbelly stove. They fell upon the food like wolves, sharing the cold beans with a ravenous intensity that bordered on violence. That night, huddled by the warmth of the stove, they experienced their first true moment of safety in over a week. It was a fragile, fleeting reprieve, but it was enough. The small meal and the warmth reignited their dying embers of hope, giving them the strength to continue. 2 agonizing days later, they crested a ridge and saw it. The 2 snowmobiles exactly where they had left them, their bright colors a shocking intrusion in the monochromatic landscape. The sight was so overwhelming that Holloway openly wept, sinking to his knees in the snow. The machines were their salvation. The fuel they'd left in the spare canisters was still good. With numb, fumbling fingers, Julian filled the tanks. He turned the key on the first machine. The engine sputtered, choked, then roared to life. The sound was a symphony, the most beautiful and profane noise they had ever heard. It was the sound of escape, the sound of civilization. Before climbing on, Julian turned and looked back the way they had come, towards the distant jagged peaks that hid Widow's Hollow. For a moment, against the vast whiteness of a far-off slope, he thought he saw it. A single, impossibly tall and thin black figure, standing motionless, watching them. A trick of the light, a trauma-induced hallucination. It had to be. He didn't wait to find out. He gunned the engine and they fled, leaving a plume of exhaust smoke hanging in the pristine air. They didn't look back again. They drove until the engines ran dry, abandoning the snowmobiles on the shoulder of a lonely logging road. And then they walked until the rumble of an approaching truck was no longer a figment of their imagination. The transition back to civilization was as violent as their entry into the wilderness had been. The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights, soft-spoken doctors, and the prick of needles. Their official story, concocted in the back of the logging truck, was a simple one. They were caught in a sudden, unforecasted blizzard. Their equipment failed. Their companions, Marcus, Leo, and Caleb, were lost to the storm and a likely bear attack. It was a plausible tragedy. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police conducted a perfunctory investigation. A helicopter flew over the valley, its crew reporting a destroyed campsite consistent with a severe weather event and animal depredation. No bodies were ever found. The case was closed, filed away under death by misadventure. No one questioned their story. To do so would have meant confronting the impossible truth, and the world of paperwork and procedure has no room for such things. Their real story was dismissed as the shared delusion of 2 men suffering from extreme hypothermia, malnutrition, and post-traumatic stress. The physical toll was severe. Holloway lost 3 toes on his left foot to frostbite. Julian's hands were a latticework of scars from nerve damage, his fingers perpetually stiff and aching. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the ones they couldn't show. Julian Carter, the unflappable survival expert, quit. He sold his company, his gear, everything. He moved to a small, sun-scorched house in the middle of the Arizona desert, as far from snow and dense forests as he could get. He suffered from a crippling case of PTSD. Sleep was a luxury he could only afford with the lights on and a bottle of whiskey. He never ate meat again. The sight of it, the smell of it cooking, brought back a primal hunger he couldn't face. Dr. Samuel Holloway was granted a compassionate leave from the university, which soon became a quiet, mutual agreement of permanent retirement. His colleagues whispered that the ordeal had unhinged him. The brilliant historian became a recluse, his home a fortress of books and maps, his new, singular obsession to find other cases, other historical accounts of places like Widow's Hollow. He wrote a manuscript detailing their experience, a meticulous, terrifying account titled The Phantom Act. It was universally rejected by publishers, who called it a well-crafted but ultimately unbelievable work of fiction. They met once, a year after their escape, in a sterile coffee shop halfway between the desert and the coast. They were two ghosts, haunted by a shared memory. Holloway looked older, his academic vigor replaced by a twitchy, obsessive energy. He slid a folded, yellowed newspaper clipping across the table. It was a small article from a regional Canadian paper. A young couple, backcountry hikers, had gone missing 2 weeks prior. Their abandoned car had been found near an old logging road. Their intended route would have taken them deep into the same area of the northern wilderness. The realization settled between them, cold and heavy. They hadn't ended anything. They hadn't won. They had simply run off the stage, leaving the set open for new actors. The Hollow was patient. The Wendigo was eternal, and its hunger was never satisfied. In the final scene, I see Julian. He's sitting alone in his Arizona home. The sun is setting, painting the desert sky in fiery colors, but he feels no warmth. He feels a deep internal cold, a chill that has nothing to do with temperature. It's a gnawing emptiness in the pit of his soul, a hollow place. It is a hunger that food cannot satiate. He looks at his hands, scarred and stiff, and then his gaze drifts to a map pinned to the wall. It's a large-scale topographical map of North America. His eyes, against his will, are drawn northward to the vast empty spaces of the Canadian Shield. The reader is left with the suffocating question: is he a survivor, forever scarred but free? Or is he merely an actor on hiatus, the hunger he brought back from Widow's Hollow a patient demon that will one day call him back to the stage to finally finish the play? The curse wasn't just the place. It was the scar it left on the souls of those who escaped.